international talks and many conversations and many meetings in different times zones at different times of the day and the night. He was previously a permanent representative of the United Kingdom into the OECD from 2011 to 2016. Previously, he was also a chief economist at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and head of the Global Economy Department, and he has a strong and long diplomatic posting in China, Japan, and United States. And today we have 1 hour with Nick, so this will in fact 50 minutes. It will finish at 6 p.m. So we have now, I'm going to pass you the floor so that you can talk with us about COP26, the key challenges, you know, the topics that you are used to. Bear in mind that you are talking for a set of audience that is not just what we have here in Zoom. We actually have also working in partnership with another organization, which is the International Fair of Science that is taking place in another place called Oeiras, close to Lisbon, and they are streaming out this seminar. So you have a big room full of people also elsewhere listening to what we are saying. And just, Nick, thank you very much once again for your time. I know your time is really scarce, so the floor is yours. And after your talk, we'll have a few questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophia, Gabrielle, Flavia. I'm now very, very, very happy to have the chance to talk to you all. And I think the best conversations are the ones that are conversations and are back and forward. So I will try to be relatively brief in my opening remarks because there's so much to talk about, but I'll try to give some headlines and then let's get into some questions and answers. And Sophia, I just am in your hands as to whether I'm very relaxed about if people just want to dive in, put a hand up or whatever, but let's just make it a really good conversation. And I really want that all of you can feel that what I say, what you're studying, where you're going to go with your lives, in your communities, in your families, in your businesses, in your academic futures. I just hope that this work is at the center of it because it's the future for all of us, and a very exciting time to be alive. It can feel very much full of anxiety, full of fear, concern, and worry about what's happening. But I think the only way I get through it is by seeing the privilege of having the chance to engage on these issues and do something locally, globally, whatever it is. Please commit to taking action on the back of this study that you're doing, because you are the future leaders. COP26 comes in less than 3 weeks, around 5 years after the historic Paris Agreement. Paris was, of course, when countries came together finally to agree in a binding way that they recognized the challenge of climate change. They shared an analysis that we had to limit temperature to well below 2 degrees, and that we needed to support the poorest and most vulnerable countries to survive. We had to finance the transition. The problem was, coming out of Paris, that we had this amazing agreement, but the commitments that countries made underneath the agreement fell very far short of what was needed. This was not a surprise. We're trying to re-engineer, reshape the global economy after all. But COP26 in Glasgow is really about showing that the Paris Agreement is alive and it's working. And what that really means is that 5 years on, the world ratchets up the commitments that it's made to get more on track to deal with the problem and to avoid catastrophe. So I'll mention 3 specific goals. The first is around the emissions, the greenhouse gases that are causing the problem. And we have to basically almost halve the emissions, minus 45, minus 50% by 2030, and get onto net zero by the middle of the century. And the latest assessment was that we were increasing emissions very dramatically by 2030. 70 countries have come forward since Paris to bring in new, more ambitious commitments. And those commitments, they don't get us to a halving of emissions by 2030. They get us to around plus 16%. It was much higher, but it's still a plus. The emissions still set to go up by 2030. So we're bending that curve. And in the last 3 weeks, and then at COP itself, we want to show the world that we understand how far we still have to go and that we will do what it takes to bend that curve and ensure that by 2030, we have got where we need to get to. So the first thing is to get concrete commitments to reduce those emissions this decade. And if we don't do that, we cannot keep 1.5 degrees of warming limit within reach. To do that, I'll come back and talk a bit more, but basically all of the sectors of the economy, particularly energy, transportation, how we grow our food and look after our nature as good stewards, and how we build infrastructure, buildings, we heat, we cool. Those are the big areas where emissions need to come really down fast this decade. And we've got lots of initiatives to try and give some momentum to that process. The second big goal is around adapting and being more resilient, protecting the poorest, most vulnerable countries especially, but all countries, and financing that. So the $100 billion is the totemic figure that developed countries have committed to spend each year, public money, that then is hugely multiplied in the private sector. And I'll come back and talk a bit more maybe in the Q&A about the finance questions, which I think you have a particular interest in, around the public and the private financing of this transition, which is so important. And the third big area is then the rules for the global economy and for the net zero transition. The Paris Agreement had a rule book, and we've not completed the rule book yet. And the absolute thing we must do at Glasgow, beneath everything else, is agree the rules to monitor, to verify, to disclose, and to reduce those emissions, and to have systems around carbon markets and pricing, around future financing, around how to deal with the loss and damage that countries are facing. Many aspects of the rule book that need concluding. So mitigating, adapting and financing, and then the rules of the road. These are the big goals. And we are basically set to get over 120 world leaders on the first couple of days of COP, which is a record and certainly the biggest ever gathering of world leaders in our country. If it continues to grow, it may be the biggest gathering of world leaders anywhere ever. But that's a hugely important moment at the beginning of COP to set the ambition and say, we will do this, we will get a step change agreed. And then every day of COP for the 2 weeks, we will have a focus, whether it is on young people, on the gender and diversity around the issue inclusion, an energy day, a finance day, a transport day, a nature day. And all of these things will hopefully be really striking new deals globally that can give us confidence that we're making this enormous shift in the economy fast enough. So basically, if I just stop for a minute, what I'm describing is that we've taken a multilateral agreement at Paris. And in order to get the adequate level of ambition out of those countries that have signed the Paris Agreement, we're running a parallel track. We're trying to transform the sectors of the economy into clean sectors because it makes environmental sense, scientific sense, societal and economic sense, and financial sense. And that wasn't the case in some areas 5 years ago. The economics of climate, the economics of clean have changed very quickly. And we're trying to say that if we can build this momentum in the real economy, that will be the thing that gives governments confidence to set the targets that they need to set, that the science says they need to set to avoid catastrophe. So that's the way that I think we've moved along the debate towards COP. The second thing I think just to say up front is around these questions of climate change on the one hand and wider biodiversity, ecosystem, environmental issues on the other. We hear these extraordinary, really concerning evidence in recent years around a huge decline in species over the last 50 years. Now 1 million species at risk of extinction due to human economic activity. And what we've finally begun to talk about, I think, in the multilateral forums is a much closer understanding of how climate change caused by the emissions from the economy is interlinked with our care for our ecosystems and their natural world. And just this week in Kunming, China, the biodiversity, biological diversity convention has opened. And at COP, we are doing a lot more on nature and on land and on air and sea quality, as well as on the direct emissions from the economic system. So we're having to knit these issues together much more closely and understand the holistic Earth system that we're trying to protect and restore. So those are sort of, if you like, the headlines I think that we're trying to achieve. The diplomatic methods and approaches are very many, very complex. To give one example, when we talk about the emissions reduction, let's take energy. The economics of clean energy is now very appealing. In the UK, we had 40% coal in our mix. And in 5 years only, we basically got to almost 0% coal, from 40 to 0 in almost 5 years.
Recording in progress.
Unthinkable shift in our decline in coal power generation, because in that period we became the world's biggest investor and producer of offshore wind. Now every country will have a different energy mix, a different way of generating clean energy, whether it's solar or wind, offshore, onshore, and bio and thermal, all these different ways that countries move forward, nuclear and cleaner gas. But thinking diplomatically, we have a huge global financing of coal investment, and we needed to cut off that stream of investment and shift it to clean investment without damaging the development pathways of the majority of countries that are still poor, vulnerable, and developing. So a big transition issue, a big economic issue, and a big diplomatic and political issue. And the three biggest financiers of coal, Japan, Korea, and China, were putting a lot of coal finance into the rest of Asia. But at the G7 this year, Japan took a bold step to stop its international financing of coal. Korea then moved next. And then at the UN this autumn, we heard from President Xi, who also committed that China would stop its investments in overseas coal, which I've seen some estimates putting at a saving of around $50 billion and over 40 major coal projects that will now be halted around the world. Now, the question next is, what will countries do domestically? Well, we've just heard from Pakistan, whose prime minister has agreed to stop coal investment domestically. India's coal program is coming down very quickly. And so all of these dynamics all influence each other. Governments listen to their own businesses. They listen to the overseas investment community, to the banking community. And what we're trying to do in every area is, like with coal, engineer what is the way to make the transition fast enough and at scale. A second example is around transportation. And actually, there are 3 or 4 major auto manufacturing hubs in the world and truck manufacturing hubs. So if those parts of the world can commit to ending the sale of the combustion engine and doing clean electric transportation, doing more public clean infrastructure in cities, then that is enough of a set of actors that can then shift the whole of the market. So we're working very hard on zero emissions transportation and trying to get a critical mass of leading countries and companies. One of the ways we're doing this is something called the Race to Zero. And in both government and business, we're asking everybody to get to that net zero position where their net emissions are zero and then negative. And the more businesses that do this, the more businesses that go to countries and say, we can't invest in your country because we can't access 100% clean, renewable energy to power our manufacturing. That's what our consumers want. Then that's helpful. The more countries that then set guidelines for accelerating clean energy, clean transport, and cleaner food and industrial processes, that then drives behavior from government, from companies. And then obviously the more that you can do together through standard setting bodies, through the multilateral development bank standards, through the international financial institution standards. So having mentioned energy and transport, let me finish the opening remarks with something on finance. Two large aspects to it, as I mentioned at the beginning: the public finance and the private finance, and then the blending of the two in the middle. But the public finance I mentioned is this $100 billion per year commitment from donors to invest in the poorest countries and help the flow and the access of finance to those who need it most to support their transition and their investments in clean economies in a way that works for them, is locally owned, is community owned, is disintermediated energy, is community owned energy. We have to do it in a way that works for the poorest countries. But that public money can then leverage huge multiples of private sector money as well. And then on the private sector side, our former Bank of England Governor, Mark Carney, and many others have been leading work to do three things. I mean, firstly, to measure, I guess, which is to disclose, so that every company has disclosed and measured its carbon footprint right through its supply chain. And if we can measure what's going on, then we can do the second thing, which is we can manage the risk. Once you've disclosed and had transparency around where the emissions are and the shifts that need to take place, then investors and consumers can manage their own risk by moving their assets around. So first we measure, then we manage. And third, we mobilize finance. And we want the private sector to essentially be a sustainable financial system within about a decade, which is an unbelievably huge challenge. But there's some real leadership out there. We have a net zero coalition of asset managers that have been responsible for $5 trillion of assets who are moving aggressively into net zero asset management. We're pushing very hard with the multilateral development banks so that all of their portfolios are net zero consistent within a small number of years. The European Investment Bank has been a leader in this space. So there's a lot going on the private side, the blended side in the multilateral development space, and then in the public side. And there are various networks. There is the network for greening the financial system, which many finance ministries and central banks around the world are part of this network, driving that disclosure, driving those common standards. There's the Global Financial Action Network, all of those investors who are trying to drive change. And all of this then has to fold back into the negotiation in Paris so that we deliver on the 100 billion. We've got huge increases in commitments from countries in the last year. And then going forward, we need to agree a post-2025 financial settlement so that countries can feel confident there's a quantum of money coming forward. So those are some of the goals of COP. Against this backdrop, you know, I get my regular briefings from the science community, and you know, all I have to say, you know, with ministers and with anybody questioning whether this is too much, questioning whether it's too fast, questioning whether it's leaving people behind, or whether we're really sure this is the right approach, then I see the most concerning projections. We have destabilized our global climate and our ecosystems. And so our models, which have been very accurate so far, our climate models, are telling us the impact of global warming in terms of greater extremes and more heating. We've really moved to the point where those models are now struggling to keep up with the level of destabilization that we've seen. You can see 120 degrees of Fahrenheit heat, 30, what is that, 48 degrees Celsius. In places like British Columbia, Canada, you can see similar temperatures in Siberia, where there is permafrost that is containing twice the carbon of the world's forests. So we are seeing temperatures and trends and things that were not expected even until the end of the century happening this year. Hundreds of data points around the world saying that this is all happening much faster than we feared. So there is no time to waste. We have to do this locally, everywhere, build to a global shift, and do it with great scale, at great urgency. And so the value of getting those leaders together at COP and hearing it from the leaders and harnessing a dynamic that is positive, that is good for the economy, good for society, good for finance, good for the environment. This is what we need to try and do. So Sophia, if I pause there, and then we please invite as much challenge, question, commentary as you like from anybody and everybody on the line.
Nick, just 1 second, Sophia. It's just on her way. Oh, right there.
That's okay.
I had a problem with my screen, and suddenly I couldn't see well. Thank you very much for your talk. We have a few questions that are coming up, and maybe I can ask a few. Maybe, and if there is anyone else that wants to ask the questions, also can use the chat, and then we can select. But some of the questions that people already sent to us was, I mean, you talk about the challenges and the facts that that there is still a long way to go, but the current trajectory of the emissions is still going up. What will be the consequences over the next 30 years if we are not able to, first of all, to avoid this going up? Let me rephrase it. Can we really be sure that we are going to be able to decrease the path that we are having now of CO2 emissions, which is not going down? I mean, lots of investments they need to be doing, needs to do. And as most of the people attending this conference, they are maybe in their 20s, 25. How can they look the future? What is the effort that all of us need to make in order to be able to believe that the planet would be balanced, even with 1.5 degrees more, but with that we can cope. Science can cope with 1.5. So what is the major driver for that to take place? Is that governments? Is that fiscal policies? What is the financial system? What is the main driver that might lead us to actually be able to be carbon neutral?
Well, this is an economic and management group, and I'm from an economics background also. And so let me just say first that there is a huge mindset change that needs to take place, and the economic management of our societies needs to be reset within an ecological mind. We've been running the two systems separately. We've been enjoying our walks in nature and our wildlife on the one hand, and running our economic systems like there is no tomorrow, and we've reached the limits of that approach. And so I think it's very helpful actually to sit back at a rather fundamental level and think about what we're trying to achieve in our societies, what we should therefore measure, and how we should think about our priorities. And I think that happily, there is a very encouraging, exciting, intellectual and emotional perspective, which is, if you think about what you all really value, you know, your family, your friends, the future for your children, the world outside your doorstep, your communities, the natural world, your living standards, your health, your life expectancy, a healthy life, and wild places and social places. All of these things point in the same direction. And they all point to a cleaning up of the economy. It is literally madness to be polluting in the way that we're polluting. And there's obviously been decades of discussion around internalizing the externality. You know, why are we subsidizing fossil fuel? Why are we not pricing pollution? Why is the polluter not paying? Now, all of these approaches, I think, remain very important. But I think that environmental economics has been defined somewhat outside that mainstream of the financial system and the economic system. And I think if we actually measure the things that matter, our living standards, our quality of life, all of that, you know, take the energy system. The way that we drive our cars and power our economies kills 8 million people a year. 8 million die prematurely from air quality, from fossil fuels, and it's madness. And now that we know that, it will take time to transition. But it's an ecological state of mind that I'm part of this planet. I'm one species amongst millions. You know, I think that there's an interdependency that is very enriching and powerful and emotional, but we've not been really measuring it. And our marketplaces are not really measuring the future in terms of their asset use. So there's lots of very good things to think about around the greater circularity of our resource use. I think that climate change is one thing I focused on today, but it sits underneath the bigger sustainable development goal framework. It's one of the 17 sustainable development goals, happens to be one that is on a track towards a pretty catastrophic outcome. But if you don't also think about water, healthcare, education, and all of these things, then you won't solve climate change because the mindset is not right. So I really encourage academically, you know, the future leaders that you are to think really from the first principle. What is the model? What are you measuring? Why are you measuring it? What's the psychology behind that? And what's the philosophy behind that? So I think that's a really great place to start. The second thing I think is just on your question about, you know, will emissions come down? Yes, I think it's inevitable that we will bring emissions down, and we'll bring them down very sharply. The question is, will they come down in time? Because we see very clearly the Chinese are going to be responsible for around 50% of future global emissions, but they are peaking in their emissions very clearly quite soon. India, similarly, is going to be the second biggest emitter in the future. They are peaking quite soon. And then the Europeans and the Americans, who created around twice as many emissions, but mainly in the past, we have already very sharply reduced. So yes, emissions will come down, there's no question, but will it be this decade a halving? Will it be in time? And it's because we only have this small carbon budget. And I think the third thing that I would say linked to the second thing is my point about the science, which is there are many more things that we don't know about the Earth systems. There are very much more things we don't know about the science than we do know. But what we do know is that the science is getting more and more alarming every year. The more we learn, the more worrying it is. And partly this is because of complex Earth systems which interact and aggregate. If you have the Arctic sea ice melting and Greenland ice shelf melting and permafrost melting, that affects the whole world. It affects the flow of the air systems and everything, and then it has knock-on effects and feedback effects. You melt the sea ice, it warms up, you get more drought, and then you get more fire, and then that emits more emissions, which melts faster and darkens the sea, which warms up the, these feedback loops and this aggregation of different things that we're doing while we're polluting the soil, polluting the water. So I think that it's a question of speed, and that's where we need to do some very difficult things, because I think we can move to a cleaner economy. But firstly, can we truly use our resources more sustainably? Because it's fine not emitting, but if you're still using billions of tons of plastics or unrecyclable material, then that's a problem. But secondly, are you able to make the transition to a cleaner economy in a fair way fast enough?
So are you saying that we have been teaching the wrong economic system to our students? So making the question the other way around, what other things should be added to economic model of mainstream universities? I mean, at ISEG, we are bringing these issues. We have a master degree focus on the SDGs, and now with sustainable finance. There is a strategy on sustainability and all of that. So we realize that we need to change, and therefore we are trying to include all of these topics, within our contents in the school. It takes time. It's a process. Are you saying that you really need a new economic theory on the mainstream books? Because there is already a different economic theory in different books for many years, but they have not come out to become the mainstream books.
Yeah, I'm not advocating. Yeah, I'm not advocating a specific change. I think what I'm saying is, firstly, that for many years these very important concepts, like polluter pays, like externalities, internalizing the externalities, like pricing mechanisms to incentivize a competitive reduction of carbon. These are all the right things to do. But maybe they've been added onto a model that is primarily, just about production, and then you try and solve the problem. So firstly, that has been important, but it hasn't led to enough of a shift. And secondly, I just think it's a good question to ask ourselves, if we have the sustainable goals that the world has signed up to, should they not be a little more at the front and center of our thinking? So, I'm out of date with my study of economics, but certainly if you read the newspapers, we talk, I would say, a great deal about GDP, about growth, and that's fine and that's important. But is it really the right balance? Is that really the goal? And I would say that the goal of growth is only really appropriate if the goal of growth is to deliver living standards, sustainable quality of life, and all of those things. And I think that, so what I'm talking about there is a bit more integration.
Yes.
And a bit more, I remember, if you think about where economics began as a profession, it began as economic philosophy. Mm-hmm. It began as
we lost that. We lost the philosophy in the meantime. I think
we lost that, and we became deliverers of market outcomes. Mm-hmm. And that's fine, but it's not enough. And so I think a more holistic consideration around what really matters is a very valuable contribution. And I'm sure you're doing fantastic work in that area.
Trying.
Yeah.
So what are you saying that now, for instance, I mean, it's a time where countries are doing their annual budget for next year. And particularly in Portugal now, the proposal for the budget has come out. So there is a big discussion on the budget for 2022. And that's it. We don't hear about SDGs. We are discussing the country's budget for next year, about growth and how can we grow, how can we increase jobs and all of that. But this conversation is not part of mainstream politicians. It's usually part of the environmental ministry, but not on the finance or even the economics. Is this something that happens across the globe?
I think so. I mean, every country has a different approach, but what you're saying is very familiar, I think, certainly in the European context. And I think one of the things that COP is doing is saying that the net zero emissions. Emissions is just one part of this, but it does drive a cleaner economy, which has all of these other very major benefits to society. The net zero conversation is becoming more central, I think, in our systems as well. So having a long-term net zero date has been a big focus for COP. And when we started the presidency, about 30% of the world had signed up to a net zero target. And now it's more than 80%. So in just over a year, that's a huge shift to basically nearly all countries saying that is the long-term goal. And that has a lot of impacts when you then bring it back to the near term, because it means you need a 2030 goal that has some resemblance to the 2050 trajectory. If you have a 2050 net zero, but by 2030 your emissions are still going up, you can't do the net zero, and it's completely useless, and people will see straight through it. So what the long-term goal is driving, I think, in Portugal and in the UK, is then a realization that in 2030, 2025, and increasingly 2021, 2022, we have to be net zero compatible. We have to climate proof our investment decisions, our taxation decisions, our spending decisions. And so we hope that COP26 is driving this kind of shift in how you drive your processes. And the good news, I think, for the treasuries of the world is that there is a good link between cleaning up your economy and very good jobs and very helpful ways of resetting your tax and spend. You start taxing bad things, you stop taxing so much the good things, and you can make the shift also in that way. And there are all kinds of proposals out there, tax and dividend, and all these things that can helpfully take us along these pathways of discussion and debate.
Well, talking about taxing, there is one question on the chat that it's related with the global carbon tax. And the question is, do you believe that an agreement around a global carbon tax can come out of COP26? Or what is the future about having a global carbon tax around the globe?
Yeah, it's been a very long-standing question, as the colleague will know, and certainly in the UK we have always taken quite a pragmatic approach, and we have some carbon taxes. We also have a carbon trading system. We have carbon levies and incentives. So if a large company introduces certain energy efficiency measures that will save it energy costs, but also save emissions, then they may get a rebate from the levy. So there's all these different measures that each country can introduce. Tax and spend decisions generally are solved, but we are seeing the OECD interesting developments around tackling the tax base erosion and the profit shifting that goes on. And I think that we are increasingly seeing globally carbon pricing and carbon trading that can come together globally. So the biggest carbon market in the world now is China's power sector carbon trading market. And we have in Europe, and we have across North America, many others. So I don't think it will probably be defined as a global carbon tax, but many countries are taking similar complementary approaches to price pollution through a combination of taxes, levies, and trading. And Gabrielle, I think Sophia's on my screen is frozen momentarily, so I don't know if you also have any other questions or comments while that comes unstuck.
Yes, we do have a good one here. I think I may go. Sophia, we're not coming back. I think she just dropped. Talking about the sustainable. Oh, Sophia's back. Sophia, I was making a financial question, but
Yes,
you
go
can.
ahead because my internet fell. Just go ahead.
Okay. What global commitment related with sustainable finance could best leverage global action towards fighting climate change?
Apologies, Gabriel. Just say that again.
What is the global commitment related with sustainable finance could best leverage global action toward fighting climate change?
I mentioned the critical areas that we are focusing on, delivering some public finance that's explicitly supporting climate resilience and adaptation. Then there's the private sector efforts, which is really, I suppose, get the one of the definitions of success would be not calling it sustainable finance anymore, but just finance, good finance, finance that drives a clean and green economy. And I think that, as I said, we are increasingly seeing, I think about $87 billion went into ESG portfolios in the last year. About 120 billion went out of the broad equity investment. So we are seeing that shift because we are beginning to get better returns from the more sustainable financial investments. So that's one angle, is that the asset managers can see the returns are there. Another angle is the banks, which also need to generate returns. And banks are not investing in coal anymore, but they are investing in clean energy. Another angle into this is public bond issuances. The UK is about to issue a £15 billion sovereign green bond. And when countries issue green bonds for particular projects, then that pulls in a lot of institutional investment. When every company is then disclosing and working out its whole embedded carbon footprint, including scope 3, including what that carbon then is, what products are then sold by the company. When it has a full understanding of its footprint, its wider sustainability footprint, not just its embedded carbon footprint, then that drives consumer behavior as well. We're also doing some important work at COP on sustainable supply chains. And this is a first ever producer consumer dialogue around the big products like the palm oil, the cocoa, these products that are decimating forests if they are not managed sustainably. But the demand for those products is largely coming from the developed world and developed consumer market. So it's a conversation for both sides. That then drives finance into more sustainable places. Now, one of your other questions before the meeting was a very good question about all the standards and the regulations that we need to get to agree how to make progress in these areas. And that is a big question that basically companies are saying, we want to do this, we're fine, we understand the problem, but just give us a guideline, give us a standard that we can work to that's long-term and predictable. So there's a lot of thinking about the standards that can drive this process faster. And there'll be more to say on that at COP.
Regarding the standards on the sustainable finance sector now, we have the EU taxonomy in terms of European. UK is also doing you're also working on your own taxonomy. I mean, the US has recently become, I mean, it has always been active, but recently has become more active on the ESG investment funds and so on. Sustainability reporting, we have different standards. I mean, are we creating too many standards? Because at the end of the day, investment funds will ask, so how can I get the data and which standard am I going to use? Are these standards going to be very different, or are we moving towards worldwide standard on sustainable finance, meaning banks, meaning asset management, meaning private equities? What is your view? Segmentation still, or some kind of movement towards one same standard, which might be difficult because we are humans and humans are difficult to agree on things
Yeah.
like this.
I mean, I think the most important thing is that whatever standards are appearing, are being created, is that they are um, trusted, that they are serious, that they do not look like greenwashing.
Yeah.
I think there's a big risk in that. So I don't think it's going to be possible to dictate a single standard from the start. I think that, you know, there is almost a marketplace for standards at the moment, and you need to sort of work out what is the most effective. But it has to be trustworthy and effective and verifiable. And that's what a lot of the conversations in the negotiations around the Paris rule book are about, so that we have a shared understanding and we can move together on that common basis. So I think that's one of the most important things. We've worked very hard with the G20. The G20 countries are very important in at least a couple of ways. One is on setting the global financial norms, and the UK and China have been co-chairing the G20 working group on sustainable finance and pushing the disclosure agenda very hard. The G20, by the way, are also critical to your earlier question, Sophia, about whether we can reduce emissions, because at the moment the gap, we're on a warming trajectory of around 2.4 to 2.7 degrees of warming. That was 3.7. So the commitments we've gained over the last couple of years have taken us from 3.7 of warming, total catastrophe, to 2.4, 2.7 range. So we're a long way towards 1.5, but a long way to go. And that's partly because the G20 have not all made their new emissions commitments. So I just mentioned that as an aside, as another area of leadership. But it's linked back to finance, because it's the G20 that are continuing to finance the fossil fuel industry in large measure. And it's how to increase the incentive to move away. Now, above all, this is really a political signal.
Yeah.
If the world of business believes the world of leaders who say that climate change is the biggest challenge we face and we will do everything we need to do to tackle it, then that convinces people that the clean trajectory is inevitable. And then the transition happens pretty quickly. But you have to give that full conviction.
Well, Nick, thank you very much. We don't want to take more time of your side. I think you left us with, with realistic views, with positive views, and special, I think, the idea that the financial system has finally started to be actively involved on these issues. It's a very good news. I think also that we are starting to talk about the need to have a new economic model that includes ecology and it includes environmental issues, not as externalities, but as embedded within the limits of the works of the economic system. It's also something positive. And another, I think it's quite interesting for the students, is that definitely there is a massive job companies looking for young people that have some knowledge on sustainability issues, and we can find lots of requests of different areas and on sustainable finance and also in other sustainability areas. So this is definitely an area of job growth and a future area for further development for the students from economics and from other areas. So Nick, once again, we are running to 6 p.m. Thank you very much for your time. And well,
and I just say thank you. I just say to all of you, be humble and be open and listen and learn, but also hold your values close. And if you're seeing things work in a way that doesn't look right, doesn't look sustainable, it doesn't look to the long term, then be strong about asserting that and saying that and changing it. So you do have to grab this and find your own way to be positive and find hope and be part of the solution. And the biggest shift in the last year or two, above everything, is the young people's voice. Some of them a lot younger than you, but still, you are young. We need that voice, and we need that fresh perspective, and we need some really, really tough messages to go to leaders everywhere. So please feel that you've got a positive role to play and really something to aim for, and try to be that leader in your community, and in the wider world. It all starts locally. So thanks again, and good luck, everybody. I look forward to hearing from Flavia how you're all getting on in the months ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye bye.